In medieval Europe, many bizarre rituals and beliefs emerged from the blending of ancient pagan traditions with new Christian practices. One of these rituals involved a peculiar and often marginalized group of people, the Sin-Eaters. But who were these individuals, and what exactly did they do? But before we dive into this time travel, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button so you don't miss any fascinating stories like this one. Let's go. These men and women, typically the poorest members of medieval society, were hired for a unique and macabre task: to absorb the sins of the deceased. It was believed that by performing this ritual, the Sin-Eater would free the soul of the deceased from sin, allowing them to enter heaven while taking on all the guilt of the dead person themselves. But what was behind this strange and dark practice? To understand this, we must go back to a time when death was not just seen as the end of life but as the beginning of a journey to the afterlife. Christians at the time firmly believed in the idea that for a soul to enter heaven, it needed to be freed from all the sins committed during life. However, not everyone had the chance to repent before death. This is where the Sin-Eaters came in. These individuals were called to perform the ritual at the funeral of the deceased. The Sin-Eater would place their mouth on foods and drinks placed over the body as a symbolic offering. It was as if by consuming the food, they were consuming the person's sins, freeing them from their burden. And, as payment for this spiritual sacrifice, the Sin-Eater received a small amount of money, a meal, and sometimes even a drink. However, this work, although seen as a great spiritual responsibility, also carried a dark and isolating consequence. The Sin-Eaters were often despised and avoided by society. After all, the act of eating the sins of another person directly linked them to evil and impurity, which made them be viewed as cursed. They lived on the fringes of society, often isolated and shunned as outcasts or even damned. Nonetheless, their role was undoubtedly essential to the religious belief of the time, as it provided a way to save the soul of a loved one, guaranteeing them a heavenly fate. The mystery behind the Sin-Eaters is a true journey through time, full of religious traditions that, although bizarre to us today, reflected the complexity of life and death in the Middle Ages. Now that we understand who the Sin-Eaters were and what they did, let's dive a bit deeper into the macabre practice of eating the sin. As I mentioned earlier, the Sin-Eaters weren't just performing a simple symbolic act. They were carrying a considerable spiritual weight. The belief that eating the food and drink placed over the body of a deceased person resulted in the transfer of their sins to the Sin-Eater was a deep reflection of medieval religious ideas. This practice wasn't just about performing a ceremonial ritual, it was vital to the spiritual relief of the deceased. In a time when the salvation of souls was central to many people's concerns, an act like this could be seen as a way to prevent the soul from being condemned to hell. Imagine for a moment the responsibility and emotional weight of someone who took on this task. It wasn't just about eating a piece of bread or drinking a gulp of beer or milk. It was about bearing the burden of all the wrongs committed by the deceased, and that burden could be viewed as eternal damnation. This ritual was a complex blend of pagan and Christian beliefs, where the idea of purification of the soul was present, but in a much more tangible and physical way than what we see in modern religious practices. The impurity of the act of eating sin reflected the tensions between the old and the new, the pagan and the Christian. Even though Christianity was against many of these pagan practices, Sin-Eaters continued to exist, especially in more remote areas where local traditions were still strong. For those who hired a Sin-Eater, it was a way to protect the soul of the deceased. It was, at the same time, a direct means to guarantee salvation and a way to ease the pain of loss, knowing that their loved one's spirit was on its way to heaven. And, as strange as this may seem today, this practice was deeply rooted in the beliefs of the time, showing how seriously the concepts of salvation and the purification of the soul were taken. To better understand the context of the Sin-Eaters and their rituals, it's essential to take a look at the pagan burial practices that existed in Europe before the arrival of Christianity. During the early centuries of the Middle Ages, the Christianization of the Germanic and Celtic tribes did not immediately eliminate all pagan traditions but rather blended them with the new beliefs. This resulted in a mix of burial rituals and spiritual practices that reflected the transition from one worldview of life and death to another. Before Christianity, many European cultures believed in the afterlife in ways that were quite different from the Christian view. For the ancient Germans and Scandinavians, death was not just an end, but a passage into another world where the deceased spirit could continue its journey. Often bodies were cremated or buried in ritual mounds, and the deceased was accompanied by material goods like weapons, clothing, and even food to help them in their new life beyond. With the arrival of Christianity, burial practices began to change. Christianity promoted the idea that the soul should be purified through prayers, rituals, and the belief in resurrection. Instead of burying the deceased with material goods, the emphasis was placed on religious rituals like masses and prayers to ensure the soul went to heaven. However, some pagan traditions, such as placing objects or money in the grave, continued to be practiced, blending with the new Christian doctrines. This fusion of pagan practices with Christianity resulted in a series of hybrid rituals. like the Sin Eaters, which were a way for culture to try to reconcile old rituals with the new Christian beliefs about life after death. The idea that sins could be transferred to another person through a physical act, like eating food placed on the body, was a way to preserve ancient spiritual practices while adapting to the growing influence of the church. These pagan rituals, like burial with symbolic items and animal sacrifices, gradually faded away, but their legacy can be seen in many of the medieval funeral rituals that persisted to this day. If the Sin Eaters already seem like a strange and disturbing practice, brace yourself for something even more bizarre: cannibal medicine in the Middle Ages. Although today it seems unthinkable, during the Middle Ages, there were widely held beliefs that parts of the human body, especially the remains of executed individuals, had healing powers. This practice was closely linked to the belief that the life force within a person could be transferred to another through the consumption of their body parts, such as blood, bones, and even flesh. The use of human remains for healing dates back to ancient Rome, but during the Middle Ages, the concept gained more traction. For example, the belief that the blood of a dead gladiator had the power to cure diseases such as epilepsy was widely accepted. It was considered an effective remedy because of the power of the blood of a warrior who had died violently and therefore possessed special vitality. For those who believed in this practice, drinking blood or even eating parts of a deceased person's body could restore health and vitality. In medieval Germany, this was taken to another level. The practice of consuming human blood was so common that even executioners of prisoners were sought after to provide fresh blood from executed criminals, which would be sold as a remedy to cure a variety of diseases. This was accessible to lower classes who could not afford the expensive medicines offered by apothecaries. This practice wasn't limited to blood. Body parts of executed prisoners, such as bones and even the brain, were transformed into ointments, syrups, and other home remedies. For those who couldn't stomach liquid blood, there were even marmalade recipes made with body parts like liver, which were considered equally effective. Although it seems grotesque and repulsive to us, these practices were seen as normal by many people of the time. For them, the act of consuming human body parts was not a moral transgression, but a way to gain power and healing, as they believed that the life energy of the person remained in the body parts after death. Over time, laws were modified, prohibiting the use of human remains for cures. However, the concept of cannibal medicine endured for centuries and remains something that fascinates to this day. Another deeply strange aspect of medieval practices involving the dead is the tradition of the dead man's bread, a practice that might seem surreal, but was relatively common in various parts of medieval Europe. This ritual, which involved the use of food as a means of keeping the soul alive, has roots in ancient beliefs that viewed the body and food as key spiritual instruments in the afterlife journey. The tradition involved the preparation of a special bread, often placed over the chest of the deceased during the wake or burial. It was believed that the bread absorbed something of the essence or soul of the deceased person. In some cultures, the deceased relatives ate the bread, believing that by doing so, they would be consuming the deceased essence, which would keep their soul alive in some way. In other cases, the dead man's bread was left in the grave or at the deceased person's house, with the belief that the food had the ability to preserve the soul of the deceased and ensure the person would not be lost in the afterlife. This ritual was intertwined with other funeral practices, such as placing coins, food, and even drink in the tomb, in an attempt to make sure the deceased spirit had everything it needed for its spiritual journey. While this practice was largely associated with pagan religion, Christianity also adapted some of its forms. Over time, in certain regions, churches began to accept the use of bread in funeral rituals, as this practice aligned with the need to ensure a smooth spiritual transition for the deceased. Beyond its religious symbolism, the dead man's bread also reflects an important belief of the time: the idea that food could preserve the soul. This concept was deeply influenced by a mystical view that food, when consumed by a living person or placed on a corpse, held the power to bridge the physical and spiritual worlds, keeping the deceased present in some way. As time went on and medieval society evolved, the practice of sin eaters began to decline, and the main reason for this was the impact of the Protestant Reformation and the growing centralization of the Catholic Church. The concept of salvation and the purification of the soul was redefined, and with that, the practice of sin eaters was gradually seen as a pagan and heretical practice. Before the Reformation, the Catholic Church had immense influence over popular beliefs. The idea of a mediator between a person and God was not unusual, and practices like the buying of indulgences, paying to relieve sins, were common. However, the Protestant Reformation, led by figures like Martin Luther in the early 16th century, brought a break from Catholic traditions. Luther criticized many of the Church's practices, including the idea that salvation depended on human intermediaries. For him, salvation was a direct gift from God, accessible to all, without the need for ritual intermediaries like the sin eaters. The idea of physical sacrifice as a means of atonement, like that performed by the sin eaters, became incompatible with Protestant doctrine. Protestant leaders began teaching that only God could forgive sins, and there was no need for a human being to absorb those sins on behalf of the deceased. With the Reformation, the practice was considered superstitious and irrelevant, and the ecclesiastical authority of human mediators disappeared. Additionally, local authorities began criminalizing the sin eaters, viewing them as part of a dangerous folk practice that was at odds with the new teachings of the Church. The Church, now more centralized and powerful, saw these rituals as a threat to true Christian faith and began the persecution of pagan practices. The marginalization of the sin eaters was inevitable, and over the following centuries, they disappeared almost entirely. In some parts of Great Britain, the practice persisted longer, but gradually became an isolated phenomenon, rarely documented. The last known mention of a sin eater was recorded in the 19th century, but over time, the memory of this practice was erased by history and by advancements in religious doctrine. The decline of the sin eaters marked the end of an era of blending ancient beliefs with new Christian doctrines, and with it, many of the mystical and supernatural traditions that characterized the Middle Ages faded away. Although the practice disappeared, the legacy of the sin eaters endures as a symbol of the tensions between the old and the new, between pagan beliefs and the changes imposed by Christianity. The story of the sin eaters reminds us of how religious beliefs and practices evolve over time, shaped and reshaped by social and cultural transformations. So, what did you think of this macabre tradition? If you were as shocked as we were, leave a like and subscribe to see more incredible videos like this. See you next time.